Good evening. My name is Margaret Bush, and I'm president of the Brookline League of Women Voters. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here to this program tonight, both those of you who are here in the room with us and those of you who will be watching this program at home. The League of Women Voters, we always remind you, is a nonpartisan membership group of men and women who do a great many voter services in the community. Tonight we're bringing you a program of information around an important set of ideas. We hope that if you're not a member, that you'll consider becoming a member, joining us. Go to our website to see some of what we're doing and some of the materials that we have on hand. We will be doing many things in the community in the coming weeks as we move towards the spring local election. We're in the process of preparing the voter's guide, and you'll be hearing from us with that and about that. This evening, we're going to talk about a really big issue. All of us probably have our own ideas about the word transparency and about the idea of accountability. But if we went around the room, we probably would come up with some different ideas and different definitions of what that all actually involves. And tonight we'll be hearing from someone who has looked at that in a very systematic way. James D'Angelo is standing next to me, and later this evening, after he speaks to us, you'll get to ask him questions. But because I'm the president, I get to ask the first question. So by way of introducing him, I'm going to ask him just a few short questions and let him tell us. First of all, tell us a little bit about your own background, way before you did all this stuff on transparency.
Well, hi. I just wanted to thank you for having me, Margaret. And we had a great talk already at Lee's house. It was wonderful. That was in the middle of December, the second Friday event. So it's great to be back. My history is pretty sundry, as people here might know. I attended Brookline High for the last few years, but I've come up from the South, and so I got teased for pronouncing sharps like this. Things like that, but got a little bit acclimated to the Boston accent. But after high school, I studied at Boston University and ended up working for NASA for a while, where I did a lot of hardware and software, a lot of sort of systematic analysis of certain systems. Then I escaped and did music for a number of years with the hardware I'd been developing. That was quite fun. But when my son was born in 2011, it was kind of a wake-up call for me. I've been doing a lot of work in Africa, looking at the environment, and very concerned about things that were happening in Congress. And I would say with kind of goofy arrogance, I started to look at Congress anew. And because I didn't have any very good connections there, I just decided to read everything I could and bring in all the data I could. I started to notice some of the things that I'll talk about in a second, but you'll see. So I sort of walked into this in a weird way, mostly due to my son, who's now 5 years old, and just registered for Runkle. So pretty exciting.
Okay. We know that you did quite a number of things after NASA also. But one of the things that would be fun for us to hear about, I think, would be just to know a little bit about that organization called the Congressional Research Institute, because that's new to us.
Yeah, so Harvard's very bureaucratic, and now you can get things up on sites and all of that. And we've been wanting to post. We did a talk last November, and so we sort of built our own little umbrella, basically a think tank, where we're looking at institutional design, which in this case means the study of Congress and legislatures. And so a number of the ideas that we're working on, we're able to post there immediately and put them out the way that we want. So it's nothing more than sort of an umbrella, this Congressional Research Institute, for what we're doing at Harvard. And it's a very convenient one because we can put anything up there when we want without having to run paperwork to anybody or wait. And when there's a T misspelled or something like that, you can go fix it right away. So it's really just a great location for our stuff.
And then, you probably would start to tell us this anyway, as you're going to speak on the topic. But tell us a little bit about how it came to be that the three of you, began to work on this particular topic.
So I made this, so I brought up the data. I had some idea in 2000 that there might be an issue with transparency. We clearly know there's some issues, and we'll talk about some of it. But I mentioned to my friend who was working on writing for the West Wing or something like that. Of course, he knew all about Congress, right? And I was like, isn't that odd? They're voting in public, right? And he's like, gave me some beautiful, elegant answer that put the idea to bed for a number of years. And then I was actually reading Fareed Zakaria's book in 2006, on page 176 of chapter 5. He writes, well, this could be a problem. There's a bit of an issue with this transparency thing. And they opened things up in the 70s. It's like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know they opened things up in the 70s. I didn't know it changed. And so I got excited about it again. I called a number of my friends. I called my buddy who had turned me down a few years before. He turned me down again. But again, kind of lukewarm response, and I just kind of put it to bed. But then when I was doing this stuff in 2011, when my son was born, I started reading Elizabeth Warren's book. I was reading everybody else's books, Stiglitz, you name it. And I kept hearing, well, something happened in the 70s, and I can't figure out what happened. Right? This thing changes, this thing changes, this thing changes. I think I'll change, and we'll see some graphs on that in a second. I was like, oh, the thing that bothered me also happened in the 70s. I wonder if there's a relationship. And so I brought in the data and was looking at that, and then indeed there's this very age-old. Thank you. No, so awesome to have you here. There's this really strange, peculiar graph of just the immediate moment of bringing the roll call date of Congress. And I thought, well, I'll just read about that. Someone's written a paper on that or has written about it. 2 weeks I'm searching and I'm finding nothing. So I have to correlate the data to legislation at the time. And finally I find this bill, the Legislative Reorganization Act. I'll read about that. There's nothing being written about this thing. Legislative means Congress. Reorganize means change. Act means it's no longer a bill, right? It's been signed into law. And I'm like, well, isn't this thing phenomenal, right? So I'm searching all over. Finally I find someone's written 2 paragraphs about it in a book that I found in the Levine Library. And at the bottom is the name, David King, 1995, wrote this. And he's the current expert now because he's written 2 paragraphs about this bill. Well, I'm going to go over and visit this guy. And sure enough, he was hosting an event a few days later, which was Hack for Congress. So they're bringing in technologists. Like, oh, great! I can come in and pretend I'm a technologist, trying to angle into this. And so I harassed him, just to get in a meeting with him. And 2 months later, he actually gave me the meeting. And the most wonderful thing happened. I walk into the meeting, he pulls up a chair, sit down, he sits down. And unlike almost every meeting I get with any scholar, he goes, tell me your story. What's up, right? And I started talking about this transparency thing, and he goes, oh my God, I thought that might be a problem back then. And so we were immediate partners. And so he's now my co-author on the paper, and then we brought in another guy as well, Brent Rinaldi, who's a historian, a Harvard historian. And so we're going to be publishing, presenting our paper April 6th, 11:30 a.m. in Chicago, which is our first moment of true scholarship publication. And then we will now be able to get cited, which is great because there's some scholars who are asking for that to happen. So we're right on the cusp of releasing it. So hopefully it goes the way we can.
It's fun to know how one thing leads to another and how it all evolves. So we'll hear more about how it really did evolve. As a longtime resident in Chicago, I think it's fun that that's the next stop for this paper too. Okay. With that, we'll go into an actual beginning and hear what happened to all of this.
Thanks, Margaret, and I'm so glad Joel wasn't here when I was talking about Brookline High, because he knows me way better than, he knows things about me. All right, so I'm gonna get started. The title of this talk is called Weaponized Transparency. And we're playing with this idea, but what we're finding is that all transparency can be weaponized. All transparency can be weaponized in every case. We're gonna be specifically talking about Congress today, and I'm going to tell you some very vivid stories about how this weaponization takes place. But I'm going to just jam in a little bit of data right away, and then we're going to get into sort of more of a story thing, and then I'm going to hope to open it up to questions pretty early, because I'm sure a lot of you will be, people new to the subject really take this rough. People who've had a few months come in a little bit better, but it takes a while to wrap your head around what we're doing. So, the title of our paper might be this. It's certainly going to be close. How all accountability, at least in Congress, overwhelmingly benefits those already in power. All accountability in Congress benefits those in power. So think the wealthy, think big oil, think any powerful group you can imagine. And how transparency through weaponization destroys the legislative process. We're not saying disturbs the legislative process. We're saying destroys it. So here's a little bit of background. 1879, James Madison's in the House of Representatives. They start forming these things called committees. Committees often have an odd number of people, usually 11, but they can be up to 30s and 40s. From 1879 to 1970, this is what your committee looked like. Okay, so probably fewer females back then, but they've been increasing. The most important thing to note here is that the committee is in a closed room. Okay, so no one else is in these rooms. So from the Constitution to Kennedy to LBJ, we don't know a single vote that Kennedy made on a single amendment in committee. Kennedy. We don't know a single thing that he said. He worked in closed rooms. Lyndon B. Johnson as well, James Madison as well. Bill of Rights, Civil Rights Act. These are all things that were drafted and constructed in closed, ultra-secret committees. President, the executive branch, sorry, can't get in. Other congressmen can't get in. Okay? So this is where the lobbyists were from 1789 to 1970. Which is why they're called lobbyists, because they are in the lobby. We kind of forget what that means nowadays, because the lobbyists are now here. Okay, so they've moved in, and notice there's even a numerical change. In the old days, there were lobbyists. People complained about the lobbyists. You'd walk out of the committee and they'd harass you. And then they multiplied and moved in at the same time. This is what today's committees look like. Right, we don't have photos. I did animation images of the old ones, right? Because we don't have any photos. But we're taking a photo, not allowed in. But today's committees, you can go watch the video reproduction of that. This is I believe, a Senate committee. And anyone is allowed in if they can get a spot in line. So this doesn't go back all the way. So here's 1953. Back to 1789, there were about 200 votes a year. So if you saw the Lincoln movie, that's a public vote, right? If you see they're going, Ed B. Asner of Baltimore, how do you vote? I vote yay. And if you see the movie, there's a lot of pressure put on these people, even during the vote. Right? They're very terrified to vote. But there were about 200 roll call votes a year. And actually what's interesting is on that very day when you have the Lincoln movie, there were 5 other public roll call votes that day. They made it seem like it was the only thing that mattered that day. There were 5 other votes that day. So there are 200 a day. 200 actually is not per year, this per session. 200 per session, so about 100 per year. And then they started talking about opening up the votes in Congress. So Kennedy hears about this in 63 or something, just a little bit before he dies, and he's like, it's ridiculous. Don't open up the votes. We're going to get pressured by everybody. And in his case, he was very worried about pressure by the constituents, sort of the mob aspect of democracy. And so they opened up a little bit, and then they passed the law that we're going to be talking about. This is the bill that I found. And this is the data that I'm looking and then roll call voting shoots up like a rocket ship. So we get up to, what is it, 1,600 per session, so about 800 per year. This number's not even accurate. This number's only the ones that are actually fully recorded and put online right now. But in every single committee that they've opened up all the votes. We're talking thousands and thousands more. Right? So your congressman each year is voting thousands of times, and all of it is now public. In '78, they ran into some problems. There was way too much voting going on. No one was able to do anything. And they passed these things that you're aware of, called closed rules, special rules. The increase of closed rules and special rules and sort of new procedures brought it back some. Wasn't able to get it all the way down, and it's been rising ever since. So the numbers of roll call votes have risen substantially. Roll call, again, being when we attach your name, and please raise your hand if you're like, I just don't get it at all what he's talking about. I have no problems with questions in the middle. But this is when they attach your name to the vote. Okay, so Kennedy voted yes on this bill or this amendment. So an interesting thing is lobbying also rose exactly at that time. So they were writing about the problem with lobbying in 1965. They were, right? And the DuPonts are doing everything the Koch brothers are doing now in '38. And Koch brothers' father is here, and he's going crazy. He's funding everybody he can. Funding Goldwater. How do you do with that? Not so good. Did all the things that we think really work now, and they're not getting very far with this. But we see the rise in lobbying. Lobbying, of course, this goes to 2015. You know, these numbers are astronomical. Partisanship. So partisanship is when the people on the right and the people on the left don't get along, excluding me and my friend Josh. Partisanship skyrockets. We see this in every single committee. When you open the committee to the public, people hardline. People on the left stay on the left. People on the right stay on the right. We've heard this from legislative directors. We've heard it from Jane Mansbridge, looks at this over at Harvard. Every piece of evidence that we have is whenever things are transparent, whenever there's cameras on, people hold their positions. As soon as you close the doors, people negotiate. So the people that you think are hardliners on all those things, the issues that you hate, they're actually softer. But the people that you think are hardliners for all the things you love, too, are a little bit softer. And there's sort of this middle ground. And partisanship turns out to be very dangerous, right? Because if you know exactly how someone's going to vote when they get elected, that raises the stakes of every election. So if this person is definitely going to hurt your business or come after you when they get elected, well, I need to fund a campaign to get them out of it. And so you have a lot of fear based on partisanship. When you don't know how people are voting, there's a lot of people working around the middle, it's a lot less danger with someone from the right winning the election versus someone from the left if you're on the left, and vice versa. So partisanship's a real problem. I just spoke about this, it raises the stakes. This is the modern day version of reaching across the aisle. We saw the exact opposite in the early 70s. Right? So it was very hard to pin down someone on how they vote. Anytime you predicted a vote, you were wrong. Congressional campaign finance shoots up from the 70s as well. This graph goes through 93, 94. You can all imagine where this goes now. I don't know if there's enough space on the screen, but it does go. And this is the one that I care about the most. America has become exceptional. America's exceptionalism right now is with income inequality and wealth inequality. Okay, so the difference between the very rich and the very poor has risen dramatically. Again, this chart only goes to 2003. It's been going up ever since. We're now at the worst point in American history. So we like to think that the robber barons back here, who were so wealthy and the poor were so poor, we've passed that recently. This has gone up, interestingly, through every single president. So went straight up through Obama, went straight up through Clinton, went straight up through the Bush brothers, the Bush family, etc. But what you'll see here is this is France. So anybody who goes, oh, well, technology's changed that, or globalization's changed that. Why didn't it change it in France or other countries? Most of Europe follows the less inequality pattern. We're unique in that. And inequality is such a big problem that people claim that it was a driving force both behind the election of Obama and our current president. So here's a quote from 1971. This is one of my favorite quotes on this whole topic. And this gives you a whole different picture of how life is in 1971. It really takes a really hard really have to imagine things dramatically to understand how different life is under a Congress that has very little partisanship, where inequality is low, where they're able to take on corporate interests. This is, Lewis Powell became a Supreme Court Justice in '72, so he was writing in '71. He was a big lawyer for the tobacco industry. He was very big into corporations being able to push around and get their way in DC. They were failing in '71, and they've been failing for many years. Business has been the favorite whipping boy of many politicians for many years. Current examples of the impotency of business and the near contempt with which businessmen's views are held are the stampedes by politicians to support almost any legislation related to consumers or to the environment. The consumers are the little people. And you look at the data, and this is there. We are passing the EPA, July 1970. We are passing some of the most powerful things to protect consumers. No banks are failing. None. They've been failing for 40 years. Something happened. Okay, so you already probably know my POV, which is that transparency is actually one of the root causes of these problems. And these are the pillars, these are the arguments we always hear about transparency. This is what transparency delivers. And if there's something not up here, please raise your hand because I want to add it to this list. Transparency allows constituents to follow Congress. Okay, so the idea is that we'd be able to suss out any sort of corruption, because all of us, 320 billion people or whatever million people, will be able to look at every piece of legislation and someone's going to find the problem in there. Okay, so that's nice, right? We'll be able to figure that out. Constituents can now, once they find this problem, will be able to hold the members accountable. Okay, so that's great, right? We found this problem, transparency gave us that, we can look in and see every meeting, and now we can take that politician out. And then transparency legitimizes the process. Okay, so these are the three arguments. If there's another good argument for transparency, I'd like to know. So legitimizes. So now we're going to look at the process, we're going to make sure it's valid, and we're going to move forward. It's going to be real good, honest information that we're going to get. So my view is if I've got to fight transparency, I've got to take out at least one of these pillars. What I'm hoping to is start to convince you today that all three are completely wrong. There is no evidence or data support for any of these things actually functioning the way that we've heard now for 50 years.
One more to,
Please.
You missed the news media. If you don't have any of those, then it all depends on what the news media says. If you got fake news, what are you gonna do?
Correct. So what you're saying is that if you don't have this, the news media will be able to spin more things out of line than ever before.
Right.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
It's interesting. I mean, we'll play with that. I personally am not the biggest fan of this modern trend of sort of fake news because I deal a lot with the elections of 1970 and 1789 when they were calling each other hippos and claiming they killed each other and all this other stuff. So I don't see the trend. But yes, the media as a watchdog is an important form and beneficiary supposedly of transparency. And I'll be happy to talk about watchdogs. I have that coming up a little bit later. But just to give you a quick summary of that is, watchdogs, as we've seen, I don't know if you followed some of the recent stuff going on with Brookings and all these think tanks, is that they're subject to the same amount of corruption that the congressmen are, except they have less accountability. So the Brookings is taking enormous checks right now to say something's good with a land deal. Everybody who's observing Congress is subject to the same level of accountability. So it's, again, becomes who's going to watch the watchers, right? Is your watchdog more subject to corruption or less? So it's something to think about. It's interesting to think about that. But stay with me. Hold to that question. If you're still not satisfied at the end, we'll talk about this more. My 5 arguments are as follows. Just under the idea of transparency, I'm going to argue today, I'm going to tell you stories today that are going to try to at least get you started down this path of saying that constituents cannot follow Congress. We already know that it's very difficult, and we know that constituents don't follow Congress. 50% of people don't even know their congressmen's names. Okay? So we're talking thousands of votes a year. I haven't met a professor of Congress that knows more than 6 or 7 votes. Okay, so we're talking about whether, we know the data says that they don't. I'm going to try and make an argument today that says it's impossible. Okay? Special interests, however, can follow Congress easily. And I'm hoping that in the story that you hear, you will see how easy that is. It is ridiculously easy for special interests. So already we see maybe there's a benefit here to a special interest as opposed to a constituent, if I can pull that argument off. I'm going to argue that constituents cannot hold members accountable. Special interests can easily hold members accountable. And I'm going to argue that transparency destroys the legislative process. So anytime you see a vote, it's not what the member intended, or you have to certainly question it. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, but there's no legitimacy anymore of the voting. And we're going to see that through a story as well. So it's story time, so I get to walk away from here. I'm going to tell you a couple fun stories. And the first thing to think about is that every law hurts somebody. Is that correct, Joel? He's a lawyer. Most laws put a burden on someone. So, we have parking out in the street, right? That's really good for some. The businesses get the benefit of those spots being free. But me, who wants to park my truck there for 3 months, I'm in a little bit of trouble, right? Why do I have to keep feeding this with quarters and getting the tickets? Why did they tow me? Right? So every law impinges on somebody. And certainly the things we'll talk about, you'll see that very clearly. So whether or not that statement is true, every law. But usually laws make things illegal that someone might want to do. Okay? So that's usually the idea. He's the lawyer, I'll let him decide on that. Now, I want you to imagine something, and a lot of people might have discomfort with this idea at the beginning because of the subject matter. We're going to talk about drones and drone strikes. But I want to imagine that the government's gone crazy, and you are suddenly the victim of a potential drone strike. Okay, I want you to imagine what that's like. Now the government is deciding to make this drone strike happen. Are you a beneficiary of transparency in these proceedings? Okay, so they're going to announce publicly who's going to get hit with the drone strike, where the drone strike might be, and when the launch might be. Does that help you?
Yes.
Well, clearly that would help you, because what are you going to do if you read your address at the time you're home on the transparent thing, and you see on the video, they're covering video of the launch screen, right? We are pressing the button. Well, you're online going, wow, this is great news for me, right? I'm going to walk out and get a coffee right now. Okay? What are you in this specific situation? Well, what's very interesting about this is you are a special interest. So the whole government might have decided, the whole country, the whole world might have decided that this drone strike was appropriate. But you're a special interest. You don't really like this drone strike, all right? So you're going to jam, you're going to do something. You might try and destroy the legislation, you might try and bribe a legislator, you might try and do a number of sort of things, but you want to avoid this happening. Now I want you to imagine you're not the victim, and you're you, or you're a constituent. And now you've got to look at what the government's got to do to put this drone strike together. Well, there's a ton of things now you have to think about, and I'm going to pepper you with some questions that'll become things that are pretty heavy, but you'll probably come up with more. So what's one of the first things that you might ask yourself as a constituent if the government's considering doing a drone strike? Are drone strikes even things we want to be doing? So you get this enormous moral question. Is the person we're shooting this drone at or this strike at, have they had a court? Are they correctly deserving of this thing? Right? You have to think of all these possible infinite questions. But now you have to decide, should we have a drone strike program at all? How much are we going to fund that drone strike program with? Should we fund it with 40 billion? Should it be 12 billion? Should it be 50 billion? These are all constituent questions. Is this person at this address? Are we going to be firing potentially at someone who's not correctly in this house, right, at an innocent victim? Well, you don't know. So now you're going to have to really understand what's going to happen if you hurt someone. Hey, Brent. If you hurt someone who is innocent, right, and all the funding and all the protections for that, are you going to have some sort of, you could probably come up with millions of questions, right? As a constituent, you don't have any good answers. All right, so you're going to be trying to follow the legislation all along, and it's going to be an infinite amount of information for you to digest, just to determine if this drone strike is appropriate. Does the company that you funded, are they a valid company? Are they using the budget wisely? Are they wasting money? Should we send in a commission, an investigation on these people? Now go back to you being the victim. How many of these questions are you concerned with? None, right? You don't care at all about all this infinite process, all the paperwork, the thousands of meetings, the hearings, and all of that. The only thing you care about is that might hit me. I'm going to look at, 338 Tappan Street. 10 o'clock, I'm out of here. So in very little time, you've understood all the information you need as a special interest because you're a special interest. I would argue that all legislation works this way. Okay, so remember, if we're going to regulate the banks, who are going to be the people who understand that best? The bankers. They're going to know immediately if the things you're trying to impose on the bank are going to hurt them or not. You think they're going to tell you if it's not going to hurt them? They're going to run bylaw 5637, which means we get richer, right? And all the constituents have to understand this very technical thing, right? If we're going to regulate microwaves, poor constituent now has to understand a microwave and understand the dangers it might provide to their kids and all these things. But if you're a microwave manufacturer, well, that's really not going to harm our bottom line at all, or that's going to harm our bottom line enormously. They're going to know in seconds. So special interests understand legislation immediately. A constituent, say you're the constituent who's being involved in the drone strike. Do you care about banking legislation? No, you just want to get out. Are you worried about what's happening with microwaves? Are you worried about what's happening with the environment? Are you worried about all these other things? You are a special interest. You are a unique interest. It takes you, in 5 seconds, you look at all of the transparent legislation and you see all the information you need to keep yourself alive. Whereas the poor constituent who's trying to fight corruption would have to spend maybe a lifetime just answering the moral questions of a drone strike, and then move over to banking, and then move over to microwaves, then move over to education, and then move to all these other things. These are all infinite questions. Can anyone tell me precisely that the Department of the Interior should be funded with $322 million? Does that go right down to the final stable? Can anyone tell me the difference between $322 million and $120 million? That's a pretty big difference. But there's no way for the constituent to even be able to determine the difference on that information without spending maybe their entire life just on that one single number. And if you look at the budget, there are tens of thousands of numbers. There's $1.6 billion for Iraqi train development. Is that appropriate? Should we be spending 4 times about on that than on the Department of the Interior? These are possible numbers. What are we spending on the drone strike? Should we be spending more? Should we be spending less? There are no answers for any of these. These will all take an infinite amount of time. Special interest, again, gets it right away. So, I'm hoping you'll see that at that point, we have favored special interests at least a little bit with this idea of transparency. I'm going to look at go ahead.
I just have a quick question. So, when you're comparing it back to the drone strike on us or this particular area, would the special interest, so if I lived in that area, would I join up with other people who also live in that area? So other people who are also special interests kind of form like one, does that happen?
A special interest is any group that's a minority,
Okay.
right? You're a general interest when you pass them into majority. So yes, you could say bankers aren't just one, right?
Right.
They might group together. They might fund more lobbying together.
Do they
Right.
tend to, or do they tend to work? Yeah, I know it's.
Chamber of Commerce is a group of many organizations. They're the largest lobbyist in
Okay.
Washington. But yeah, they tend to join forces. Why not? It's very expensive to get laws changed. And so the better you can form forces against the general interest, which are constituents. So a special interest is called a faction by Madison. Madison looked at factions as groups that wanted to mess with the general interest, to take something that the general interest did not want. So yes, it's exactly what happens. It happens quickly, right? Yeah. So again, I believe that all legislation is similar to a drone strike. And no one questions drone strike. Oh, that should be secret, right? Because then the guys will know and they'll run. Well, think about banks as tackling the national interest, taking on the national interest, right? Taking on individuals. And when we see the rise in inequality, we see the correlation between transparency and the rise in finance, the finance institutions. This other story is, go ahead.
Think about your sample of parking users.
Yeah.
The minority, in that case, is a majority, because all of us are using parking meters. But we are all impeded by this use. The limitations, so by impeded by limitations. But aren't we accepting them as a greater good? The limitations?
Right, so this is the common goods problem. This is yeah. So it's a possibility in the short term that you would appreciate having all parking meters free. Whenever they do that, though, people quickly move back, right? Because then you can't go anywhere. The town, you get, parking meters are actually used very frequently just to eliminate traffic, right? So if I keep my parking rates high, I'll keep people out of the city on cars and they'll be on public transportation. I think you might agree. We've been using parking meters since, what, the 50s or the 40s or the 30s. The first parking meters I think they opened up, there was some guy who moved his family there and had a kitchen table and was feeding the meter and was having a good time. I think you might appreciate it if we went back. But you've got a case there. I see your point. But I think you see where I'm going with that. Okay. Fun life. I mean, yes, and tragedy of the commons is a big part of why government is important, right? To protect us from ourselves, right?
Thanks.
So the title is Weaponized Transparency. I'm going to tell a story about how transparency gets weaponized, and it is so deadly and so debilitating that this drives what we think is most of the amending process in Congress today. And I want you to, so you imagine you're a victim of a drone strike. I want you to imagine you just won public office for the first time. Okay, and you've maybe spent your whole life running for office, and you've got 3 or 4 things that you really pushed and resonated with the people, and now you land in Washington, D.C. as a new legislator. And your first day in office, say the things that matter to you are, more parking spaces, more spaghetti, and I don't know, and what? And protecting yourself from drone strikes, right? Okay, so you've got more spaghetti, more parking spaces, protecting yourself. These are the things that you ran on, that resonated with your constituents, that got you into office, okay? And you're really excited, you've tried your whole life, and we're gonna claim that you're the most ideal legislator, the one we wish were in Congress, right? These people, right, almost all the other solutions you see, we're like, oh, the congressmen are so bad, get all those bums out, put in really good people, right? I'm actually kind of the view that they're okay, and they're getting, well, we've kind of lost the microphone. That they're okay, but these things that I'm about to talk to you about
are corrupting the system, and they're unavoidable even though you're an ideal legislator. So how can you corrupt an ideal legislator who's not willing to take a penny to do anything corrupt? And by the way, the NRA gives about $10,000 at the most per year to a legislator. Would $10,000 change any of your minds on gun legislation?
No.
It just seems small, doesn't it? Doesn't it seem a little small? Aren't we a little, it's like, isn't that a little pathetic? Right, are these people really that pathetic, the ones we're sending into Washington?
Yes.
I would claim that it's more what is about, you're about to hear. So you've won office, you walk in on your first day, and you realize that you want more parking spaces, more spaghetti, and protect yourself from drone strikes. And the first thing you've got to do is make sure that the things you worked on get voted on in Congress. They need to somehow make it to the floor to have a vote. How do you do that? Well, the rules in the House are the Speaker decides the agenda. The agenda is a very powerful tool. Very powerful tool. If your things don't make it to the calendar, let me tell you, they ain't becoming law. Right? So it has to be on the calendar. If it doesn't get voted on, it doesn't become law. Hello, Mrs. Speaker. Hey, how are you? You had a great, you ran great out of Brookline. Oh, that's great. You want more spaghetti, more of this, that, more of the other things, right? I saw you ran a great thing. Yeah, I really need to get those voted on. You're new here, aren't you? Oh, you want to get those voted on? That's so cute. Oh my God, so happy to have you. Oh my God. Let me tell you, you see my calendar over there? That's full. How long is it full for? Well, you're here 2 years, it's full for about 3 years. Excuse me, I just ran like crazy. I knew when I made it, I could finally turn government around and make the world perfect, right? And you're telling me the calendar's full, I won't get any of this stuff? No, okay. I'll tell you what though, I really liked how you ran, really liked it. I'll give you a break. You come talk to me in 2 months. So you're like, okay, well, what do I do for 2 months? Well, go out and vote, go do things congressmen do, right? Congress people do. So you go every day, someone's proposing some bill, you make a vote, you're the honest one, right? You're the good one. You read all the bills, as I said, very hard to read, right? You gotta read all the stuff on drone strikes, all the stuff on regulators, all the stuff on this. It's an infinite amount of stuff. When I say infinite, it is. The Commerce Committee, since 1950, has published 1 million pages of hearings. They're one of 20 committees. All laws are based on the old stuff as well. And no law has the stuff from the hearings, right? Laws are like indexes, right? We're gonna pay this amount, this. You've gotta read 1 million pages per committee. It's 20, 40, about 40 committees. So about 40 million pages that you're responsible for. And that's just the hearings. So anyways, so you go out, you start voting, you're reading everything like crazy. People are talking. Remember, hearings are full of errors, mistakes, and bias. We like to think of hearings as like, well, technically, the sun is 4 billion X miles away from the earth and blah, 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 and it's all perfect. No, they're going, every warm-blooded American knows the sun's not too far from the earth, and we need to get it closer by doing this, and everybody wants us to go out there and fly our new Honda Civics into the moon or something. You know, it's just bias, whatever they're saying. So you read these hearings, and you're like, I don't believe any of that. You know, I'm a warm-blooded American, but it's not for me. So remember, we like to think the congressional record is sacrosanct, but it's some great thing. But please read it. You know, show me where the good stuff is, because it's hard to find. So you're there, you're voting like crazy, right? And you start voting. Well, guess what? Since 1970, your votes on all amendments are broadcast onto this big board. So I'm James D'Angelo. I vote, boom, green. Oh, green. Next to my name. Great. I'm voting positive, right? Don't like that. Boom. Red. Next to my name. Great. So I go back in 2 months. And
First thing I learned in a graduate course at Harvard government is congressional record is not a scholarly journal, and it's fiction. And what you see as a vote is not necessarily, that person might have been in Russia when that vote was taken. It's completely useless.
it's precisely true, but that's what you're being weighed on. Nowadays, you actually have to be there to vote.
Repeat the question. Some kind of mic, it's very hard
Oh,
to hear you.
she said the first thing she learned in her graduate program, she was at Tufts and the Fletcher School, correct? Was that the congressional record is full of junk, basically, is what you were saying. And that the voting itself, this applies to my last point, which is the legitimacy of transparency. And the vote itself is something that we should question, okay? And you'll be seeing this in a few seconds at the end of the story, why it is something we should question, okay? But that's an excellent point. So you go back to the speaker. The speaker's like, my God, I've never been so impressed with a new legislator in my life. Oh my God, I saw you out there every day reading like crazy. You are voting like crazy. You did all those wonderful things. And you're like, yes, but I need more parking, more spaghetti, and fewer drone strikes. Oh my God, let me tell you. Oh, wait. Oh, well, isn't that remarkable? Oh my God. You know, all your votes that you voted on, well, they get popped into my computer right here. And I just noticed something funny. You voted 78% of the time against the way I vote. 78% of the time. You must really not like me. You know, someone just walked out of the office, wants 3 things on the calendar, they vote 84% of the time with me. Now, I'm not going to say anything more about this, but maybe we talk in a couple months. There's no overt threat there, but you know exactly what he's saying, right? He's saying that if you want the things that you care about to be voted on by the U.S. Congress, you need to start aligning your votes with his, or if it's a she, with hers. And if you don't, those things will not make it on the calendar. So you now have a choice. And what's that choice? Do the 3 or 4 things that really matter to you and sell out everything else. Or vote the way you want on all these things where you're 1 in 435 and accomplish nothing and probably not get reelected. And let me tell you, neither of those decisions are good. You're the ideal congressperson who's just come to change Congress. And what's just happened to you? You are sinking through the floor. You are already in trouble. Now imagine if the speaker cannot look at how you voted. What is the speaker going to do? Cannot say for certain that anybody voted their way or not. They just know the votes aren't going well their way or whatever. What that's called when the speaker can't watch your votes and you get to vote the way you want, that's called democracy. I don't know if you guys have heard some of that, but that would apply in Congress even, where each person has equal power, each person has an individual vote, and not one person taking control of the entire vote. And guess what? The speaker's not the only one who's going to make that deal with you. If you're in the minority, your minority leader's going to do that to you. Right? Your minority whip is going to do that to you. Okay? The president is going to do that to you. Oh, you want the funding for that bridge back in your district? You want the new meters? I'm the executor. I write the check. And I've noticed that you're 68% of the time against me. Doesn't even need to say it now because we know exactly what that means. Right? These threats are implied, they don't have to be spoken, and they really exist. Which is why you get, as soon as you open the vote, you get this weird thing called partisanship. You have to align your votes to leaders and power. And you can no longer do your ideal congressman game. You're screwed from day one. Which is why when you yell at congressmen and go, oh, you guys are all corrupt, they're like, yeah, sorry. Because they know they're making these terrible decisions. They're feeling it, they're really hurting inside, right? Again, I sympathize with these poor people. And back in the day, you didn't have to do that, right? You talk to the president would be like, oh, I'm not going to give you something in your district. Like, close the curtain, be like, sorry, guy, right? That's the way the secret ballot works. Heartbreak on day one in office. One more story. Oh, go ahead.
I thought you might be interested in, Barney Frank once said, the only time I got to vote for the perfect candidate was when I ran for the first time. The second time I had a few problems with my record.
It's absolutely true. He's one of the most vocal on this, right? He said, I was the perfect congressman for a few months. And let me tell you, because he had that discussion. So he's great about that. And he talks about using intimidation. There's a video of him using that intimidation because he became very powerful to jam it to other people. Right? And he said, oh, you got to use it. And of course you do, because if the Democrats don't use it and the Republicans do, well, guess who wins? So you have no choice. So it's an arms race. So we'd like to say, oh, these guys are bad for abusing these guys, but if you don't do it, you're not serving your people. Because if you're a Republican and you really care about your things, and your people really care about you, you need to do it just as much as they do. So the Republicans aren't bad here. Democrats aren't bad, the speaker's not bad. They're responding to the realistic pressures that exist. But you can take all those pressures away in 2 seconds, right? By returning this back. Weaponized transparency is even further than this. As I say, all transparency can be weaponized, and you're starting to hear about this, right? You know, we see the special interest of you of the drone strike, where transparency really helps you avoid any sort of damage to you. And yet, by the time you learn the system, you might be able to tweak some of the agenda to maybe get the drone strike going on someone else, because you become a specialty at this, right? You're the person who knows best how to treat drone strike information. Weaponized transparency also works like this, okay? And this is another real story, and this might account for 90% of the current amending process, both in the state level, local level, and at the feds. Again, you've just walked into Congress, but you just beat someone. So you had this nice little tight race, right? And you beat this person who you didn't like at all. And you win, and you're just like, oh good, I'm free, right? I'm good. That person over there has likely got friends in Congress. And they don't have to be powerful friends at all. But they know now that all your votes are public. And you likely have to vote on everything. And what they're gonna do is they're gonna find out the things that really mess up your constituents. So issues that you didn't have to run on, issues that weren't a big deal at all. Say there was something with a new school in Brookline going up that takes your really wonderful constituency and divides them down the middle. He's gonna start writing amendments. Your enemy in Congress, who wants his buddy back in, now starts writing amendments called gotcha amendments. All right, these gotcha amendments are, well, we're gonna look at defunding the public school in Brookline. He doesn't even care, he doesn't have to do any research. We're gonna look at funding it. He doesn't care if it's good or bad for that school in Brookline, right? He's just gonna write it, and now you're gonna have to vote on it. What does that do? That divides your constituents in half. Say you have an issue with gambling in your town, or something where some of them want new jobs, other people really hate gambling really bad. He's gonna write another one. He's gonna keep finding issues that might be problematic. He doesn't even have to be sure if they're problematic. Doesn't even have to do his research. He's gonna write all these amendments at you. Wait, I thought he's supposed to write amendments for the good of the people. I thought we're supposed to be spending all our time working on legislation that's important. Well, as soon as you realize that they're writing these gotcha amendments at you, what do? I'm gonna write some back at you. And what we saw is from, as soon as they opened it up, the amending process went haywire. It went from 200 a year to 1,800. That's all crap. Not all, it's a lot of crap. That's all time that your legislators, because if I'm having a war with you, Connor over here doesn't know that it's a war. He's reading these amendments. He's trying to do the good thing. He's reading all this funding and who cares what the, I've got to read this. Oh my God, I'm losing all my time. I'm writing all these amendments. I never knew there were so many amendments. What, gambling? What, we're federal, it's state? What, I've got to vote on this. You're spending all your time trying to resolve a war that you don't know exists. And again, this is the vast majority of the amending process in Congress. As soon as you turn it off, can I write a gotcha amendment at him? Pointless. This is not going to call him out. And when I write 10 gotcha amendments against him, in 2 years, I call him my buddy and I go, he's voted on all these things this way, take him out in the election. Show that to his constituents. And all the constituents are there, oh, transparency, oh my God, my congressperson, he's such, I thought he would be great. It was really terrible. He didn't get anything done because we didn't get meter spaghetti or less drone strikes. And he's got all this, I didn't know he had such a sordid history. And that's all you see in the congressional record. All that voting, either pushed by the speaker or about stuff that doesn't matter. I'm thinking I might stop there. Anyone feels like asking about the NRA, tell a great story about the NRA as well. Oh, this is pretty awesome. This is a little video. Everybody likes video, right? Let's see if I can actually activate it. Here he is. This is Hurricane Katrina. We couldn't understand why only 70 legislators voted for funding in support of the victims in Hurricane Katrina. It was just shocking. No one could figure out why. Now with a little prep that you've had about transparency, I want you to listen to this guy talking about why no one voted for the funding. Let's see if I can find my cursor again. Oh, I don't have an audio thing. Okay, so she said, well, you've got all this transparency, why is all this happening? He's like, well, because transparency works both ways. Right now you have interest groups that put out lists that say, if you vote for funding any of this in Katrina, we're gonna take you out in the next election. Specific groups that don't want funding taken away from anything that matters to them and given to people who are in need, right? And these groups are gonna take you out. And he's a former representative, wrote this book. This is only a tiny section of his book. I don't even think he really understood just how mad this is. The only reason you get 70 members for aid after Hurricane Sandy. He's naming all the groups that put on the list that they'll take you out. It's worse today than it's ever been. Of course it is, right? Because you couldn't do it before. How would you make a list of how someone voted if you don't have anything about how they voted? Let me see. I'm going to flick through these slides, but I'm going to open up for questions with both. Well, let's see if I've got anything. Yeah. No, I'm going to open up for questions. If I need one of these slides, I'll go to it later. I'll just run. I'm going to. Our solution is we think is the only way to take money out of being the main source of the problem. We think it's the only way to stop a lot of this corruption. As you can see, if you took all the financial interests out, all the outside special interests, which are perverse in terms of transparency, you still have all the weaponized transparency taking place inside the House, right? And inside Congress, when they're firing bullets at each other, when they're calling them out on votes. Go ahead, what was your question?
So what about
What's your name, sorry?
Ryan.
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 Nice.
So what about transparency in corruption and showing the corruption? Is there merit in that?
Explain.
So what you're doing here is you're educating us on certain issues that are happening that people who are even remotely interested in government, or even maybe more than remotely interested in government, potentially might not know about. What happens if we educate our constituents or the public on certain issues like this? Would there be a better way to kind of push back on some of it?
So say we educated the people, is what you're saying. We can educate the people and they'll be on top of government. Again, we're talking thousands of votes a year on things that literally are thousands and thousands of pages. And in many cases are impossible to say yes or no on. So you have watchdog groups that try that, right? They try and tell you how to vote, but they become a special interest themselves, and they've run into lots of problems doing this themselves. If you have an infinite, it's information overload. We see that in a lot of systems, right? If I'm selling you a used car, I know everything about the car, you know nothing. The amount of time it would take you to make that decision, it's actually more time than the amount of time you have, right, to make the decision. A used car is much simpler than Dodd-Frank, all right? And Dodd-Frank's only one piece of legislation. You have so all environmental bills, all the crime bills. The crime rates, by the way, crime rates, incarceration rates, we believe is driven by transparency.
By what?
Transparency. Incarceration had been dropping for 40 years up until 1970. And at that point, they were talking about eliminating jails altogether. Talking about eliminating jails. There were 300,000 Americans in jail, and the number had been dropping. Now there's, what, 1 to 2% of our population's in jail? It's gone crazy. And private prisons and government prisons are enormous lobbyists. And this happens a lot on the state level, see a little bit on the Fed.
So what can we do then to help drive this change?
learning about it, right? Obviously, questioning it like crazy, making sure that you're confident. What I find is that I'll tell someone about it, they'll be like, this is the best thing in the world. Then they'll go tell someone about it, and they'll go, I don't have the answer for that, sorry, and then they'll get chewed apart, sort of like I did when I first thought about it, right? It takes a lot of, it's not a simple thing, right? It's not, you know, most of the time, I got chewed out yesterday on Joshua's Facebook feed, right? For one guy who didn't go through my material, but found one little aspect and just came at me really hard. Right. It happens so much, right? Because people really want to believe that transparency is helping. And so it's a real problem, right? And if you want to raise money to fix Congress, guess what you put in the first line of your proposal? More transparency, more accountability. And guess what? That's why inequality is rising. That's why all these things are going through the roof, right? And that's why all of Congress is just becoming a mess. You can't get things done. If you've got partisanship, you've got gridlock. If they're voting on things that don't matter to anybody, you've got gridlock. Wouldn't it be great? Would it be great if they could actually do some of this?
So does this mean then? Sorry, I'll be done after this. Does this mean then we put blind faith and blind trust in our congressmen and women?
Who are you going to put it in? Can you read the votes? How many votes do you follow here? Right? Are you going to put it in someone else, the guy up the street who's running the Watchdog website? Do you know that he's not taking contribution? Who are you going to put it in? Again, who's going to watch the watchers? Hey, you need to stay awake at night. Well, I don't trust him. Well, you need to stay awake at night. Well, what are you going to do? Right? This is, and let me take this one step further, which is, I'm under the belief, I can't prove this. Brent hates when I say this. I'm under the belief that you took 435 people at random, didn't vet them at all, include criminals. Under secrecy, you would get good general legislation. And I believe I can support that with a number of arguments. I believe the people we're voting for are great people. In most cases, you certainly have corruption moments, right? But again, if you have a case of bribery, that's a transparency problem anyways. I'm going to pay you X amount for your vote. Well, you're not going to give him any money if you don't know how he votes, right? So every problem that you have goes back to transparency problem, right? But again, it's who's going to watch the watchers. If you really think you've got better people, try and put them in office. Try and vote them and put them in office. But we're not finding very good data saying that congressmen under secrecy are doing bad things. Now, there's one caveat to that, and the caveat's actually a strong one if you look at the current makeup of the Senate or most Congresses. If you have a special interest as a majority of a legislature, you're screwed either way. So if they're all bankers, you're going to get banking legislation secrecy or transparent. So this takes place this is really important if you look at developing countries, where people are like, well, will transparency or secrecy help Uganda? Well, the MPs in Uganda are all the top 0.01% of the country, and they're all making money off of foreign aid. You're not going to get any help. At that point, I'd say transparency at least might give you something. But secrecy, they're all just going to collude anyway. So you can't have a special interest. And Madison worked really hard. Why does he have a representative from every district? Right? Because they wouldn't know each other. Right? You don't want a special interest. You certainly don't want all Pats fans in your legislature, right? So that be real trouble if you're somewhere else. But just to imagine the opposite. Imagine if your legislature was entirely composed of pregnant teenagers. Would laws be different? Of course they would. They'd be substantially different, right? And so we do have a special interest in the Senate. In particular, right now, it's mostly male, it's mostly white. It's a problem. They decide justice. They decide the Supreme Court. They decide all that stuff. So that's a problem. This doesn't solve that.
So
What's your name?
Jenny.
Hey,
Can you
Jenny.
tell the NRA story? Because I don't understand why $10,000 is enough.
The NRA story is great. It's great. Let me take one more question before I get to that.
Following up on this young lady's question about, what can we do? A lot of what you're saying applies to local things. I mean, we talked about our congressional representatives, but same thing at state, governor, governor's council.
It does.
State legislature,
everywhere.
local, town or city,
Italy, Brazil, we see the
selectmen
same thing. It's really that.
But that's a little easier for us to, it's not simple by any means, but it's a little easier for us to get our arms around.
Yeah.
And, I know there's, people in there, town meeting members and
I've got enemies at Harvard, right? I have people who've written books on the benefits of transparency. They're just lacking a little bit of data on transparency being good.
Means you're doing
And
something
then
right.
once they come to that conclusion, which has no footnotes, they can jump to all these conclusions, right? And they hate me, right? You know, it happens. So there's a fight out there because people have spent their careers based on transparency being good. The flip side is actually very weird, and Brent will hate me for this because I don't have perfect data on this. But we have evidence to show that some of the groups, they closed down the taxation committees in '86, just at the last minute. The New York Times does a great piece on this. One guy from the insurance company who's trying to change taxes for the insurance industry packs up his bags when they close the doors, because you can vote to close the doors. It happens very rarely. So all of a sudden the lobbies have to leave. Well, the guy's packing his bags. The guy from the New York Times goes up to him, "What are you doing? You're leaving." He's like, "What do you want me to stay there and watch them build my gallows?" And so the lobbyists were leaving town, right? What I read, and I suspect to be true, is that those people that were leaving town that day became the biggest proponents of transparency, and they started funding the transparency revolution. If you look at Ngram on transparency and accountability in the 1970s, it's as low as it's ever been, right? There was no popular, anyone who lived that period didn't hear, "Oh, transparency in Congress, we need to open them up, most important thing ever." Nothing. This thing was pushed, in many cases, by lobbyists. And again, if you talk to Brent afterward, he's the expert on that. And it passed very quietly. And when I say very quietly, this is the first time you're hearing about it, is my guess, right? So this thing's been pretty quiet. But there's people that understand that it was helping them. All right, so the NRA is fantastic. And why is it fantastic? Because it breaks apart this myth that money's the problem. Campaign finance is the problem. That congressmen are all greedy, that they want to take a bribe. My brother actually put this best. He said to me, most people don't want to, they'll admit to a bribe because it meant there was a positive action. I gained, I looked good on that, I made some money, I'll admit to a bribe. I'll be okay if you accuse me of bribery, right? That's kind of manly almost. But intimidation, that's not cool, right? The NRA uses intimidation almost exclusively. And when the guy was talking here, he's talking about intimidation. Now, if you read Larry Lessig's book, or two very wonderful people, Larry's great, and Zephyr Teachout's book, both on corruption, both some of the best sellers on corruption, neither of them mention intimidation. We believe that intimidation is at least 10 times more powerful than any form of campaign finance or bribery. And we saw it already with the speaker. The speaker goes, 78% of the time you're voting against me. That's a threat. Vote with me or else you don't get reelected. Vote with me or you're screwed here, right? That's a threat in no uncertain terms, okay? It's kind of a bribe. He's gonna offer you the agenda, but it's really a threat, right? You better change your action. The NRA plays a much more, what did Machiavelli say? He said, if you want to control people, he didn't say hand them all $5, right? That's too expensive anyways. Machiavelli said, hang one of them in public. That's cheap. The $5, that lasts about 5 minutes. Hanging one of them in public lasts 100 years, right? Then you hang one in public every few years, and boy, you really got them. They're not going to move on you. Okay, this is Machiavelli saying this directly. The NRA understands that perfectly. And when the NRA does their work, they don't even like to work in the federal level. Too expensive. I got to take out a national ad. They focus on all the states. They find state legislators. And so we've got Sandy Hook in 2012, in 2011, Deborah Maggart, Tennessee, A rating with the NRA. And by the way, NRA members are actually pretty cool. They actually really wanted tougher laws after Sandy Hook. 82% of the families with an NRA member wanted tougher laws after Sandy Hook. That's the family to imagine without, right? So it was over 90% acceptance in the United States. Yet the Senate did not vote for tougher laws. Here's why. Deborah Maggart in Tennessee, so she's in Nashville. Is that the capital of Tennessee, Nashville? Anyone?
Knoxville.
Knoxville. So she's in Knoxville. Sorry, where is Knoxville? Okay, we're over here, right? So she's in Knoxville, and she's doing her thing. She's running for office. She's coming up for election in the next year. And she decides this crazy thought. She's like, wow, loaded guns in parked cars at shopping malls. Let's make a law saying that the car needs to be locked. A crazy, crazy idea she had, right? So she puts this forward. The NRA goes, got one, a local legislator, gonna be cheap, we're gonna destroy her. They go after her, not with everything they got, because she's cheap. They put in 80 grand, that's it. 80 grand to take out full page ads in the papers, to run radio against her, to put up websites, did everything they could, and they knock her out of office with $80,000. What do they do when she gets knocked out of office? This is the most fascinating thing in the world.
That's what I don't understand, because you're saying that even the people who are NRA members weren't against, so who's casting the votes?
Well, keep in mind that the NRA ad, are there guns in the ad? Are they talking about guns?
So even
What if they're
though
finding
you-
something, what if they're aligning her with Obama in the year it's bad with Obama? If you've seen recent NRA ads, oftentimes no guns are mentioned. They're going, oh, she's really bad on the gun issue. Really pay attention to the gun issue. They were doing that after Sandy Hook when they went after Joe Manchin nationally. They were like, Obama's buddies with Manchin.
Oh, okay.
Funded by the NRA.
Oh,
Nothing to do with guns.
okay.
That's how the power works, right? You don't talk about the issues. Why would you talk about the issues? You want to take them out, okay? So Manchin runs, they're taking ads, whatever they think's gonna work, right? They find that someone wrote a story that she stepped on a poodle once, so they're running all ads about poodles, who cares, right? They knock her out of office. Everyone knows it's funded by the NRA. Again, doesn't have to be about
So
guns.
you think most of the NRA family wanted guns to be controlled?
Correct. 80% after Sandy Hook. Sandy Hook was a big moment for the US. They wanted tougher regulations in 2012. The citizens, the constituents, us.
Citizens and an NRA.
Members in the NRA, right. Remember that the NRA is a tiny group of people with a lot of members, okay? So it's different. And they were grouchy. There was contention at that time.
Finish what happened.
But let me finish the story. So she gets knocked out of office. What does the NRA do? And this is the most fascinating part of it. They take out ads that they knocked her out. Why? In case the guy in Alaska didn't know. You're running for office in Alaska, you better know. We're gonna come get you. Right? Oh, does Joe Manchin know about Deborah Maggart? You bet he knows about Deborah Maggart. And when Sandy Hook happened, who was CNN go to interview? They go interview Deborah Maggart. And what did she say? I don't know how anyone's gonna do this. How is anyone gonna step up if they play like this? Right, where all they do is take out anybody who steps out singly against them. What was the NRA doing in 1969 before transparency? They were teaching kids how to shoot. That was it, right? But these institutions start forming, and they just become these really crazy monsters. And with the NRAs, I might be picking on them now, but they're not unique, right? We've got really wonderful on both sides of the fence, really nasty. And one of the most famous ones is actually mohair, right? Mohair's now not in the budget. But I think up until 2014, you could read the budget, and there was a subsidy for mohair. Does anyone know what mohair was in the budget for? No one here is old enough to know why mohair was in the budget.
Comes from rabbits.
Mohair, is that true? It comes from rabbits?
Yep.
Okay, I didn't know that. But Lee, you have stepped up once again as the person who knows everything. Oh, that's not Lee, sorry.
Yes,
I'm sorry, I don't have my glasses. But I see Lee over here. Mohair was, they gave a subsidy to it after the First World War because it was used to make the uniforms of soldiers. It would wick water away pretty good. By World War II, they were already introducing nylon and cottons and synthetics and all that. The subsidy stayed. Why can't every congressman, every single one, looks through the budget with a fine-tooth comb going, where can I cut? Well, there's nothing easier than cutting mohair, right? It wasn't even really big, 16 million for mohair. We're just gonna cut. Oh, if you cut those mohair guys, they'll run 2 million of that 16 million back against you. Oh, I'll step away from mohair, it's not that big. It's just 16 million, right? How many times does that appear in the budget? So in 1970, Jonathan Ralph starts to notice this problem that you can't cut anything. And he writes his book, famous book, 1994, Demosclerosis, where any program that you install cannot be cut, because you've now given them money to come back and torture you if you try and cut that program. Under secrecy, they're all gone. They're all gone. Right? All these lane programs die immediately. Congressmen are dying for the money. Dying for the money. But the NRA story continued just a little bit. So Joe Manchin steps out, very brave. He had an A rating with the NRA as well. He steps out and proposes some minor, ridiculous thing. I forget what it was. At first, the NRA sits down at the table, and then they turn. They just decide they didn't like it and go after him with national ads. And those national ads had nothing to do with guns. They were linking him to Obama. Manchin survived. Does that mean that everything's okay? Manchin didn't get knocked out of office. Does that mean everything's okay? Or does it mean every single congressman knows that they'll take $2 million out against them in national ads? Well, I think the proof's in the pudding, because a week after they did this national ad, they sent a letter out to all the senators saying, look, we're watching your votes on this. We're watching the little ones, the procedural, the cloture votes, the proposal votes, the amendment votes. We're watching all of that. And if you step out of line against us, we're going to come after you for the little votes, the votes that we know no citizen is watching. No citizen is watching. And of course, when it hit the Senate, it died. So that's the NRA story, and that's a transparency story. And they're endless. You'll see it everywhere. Any more questions? What is your name? Sorry, I can't see you that well.
I have a question which I think is sort of a challenge, since you've sort of laid out all of this horror story. What's the solution?
I actually don't think it's a horror story.
Or even a strategy to combat it?
Yeah, I don't think it's a horror story. A lot of us are really pulling our hair out right now. We're really confused, right? Why has the U.S. gone from being the most aggressive on climate and the environment in 1970 to one of the worst in all the international negotiations? If transparency is the reason, and I suspect it is, well, then secrecy would help. I've never spoken to a congressperson who's gone, look, I just don't believe in climate change. That is just the stupidest thing ever. Everybody's just inventing it. They close the door, they talk to you, go, look, I really get it. I mean, I really do, but am I really going to vote on climate stuff when all my constituents and all my pressures come from oil or something else? They tell you. But imagine if they're able to vote openly on both, right? And take care of their constituents and take care of the environment. Who knows what it is, right? But there is a pill there. All these solutions with Congress that we're failing at, that we're not getting nowhere with, often involve amendments, often involve massive pushes, often involve lots of resistance, often involve changing the Constitution, right? Some of the things that we're asking for, going against free speech or freedom of speech. So Citizens United doesn't bother me much. It doesn't really bother me at all. I have no problems with a congressman going to the most expensive, lavish parties in the world and spending his entire month there and coming back and voting secretly on how much he should tax those people. Yeah. I have no problems with that at all. Because I know me, I know most people in Massachusetts. We don't love the poor so much, but we really hate the rich, right? Even if we're partying with them. So we close the curtain and we'll be like, tax them higher. We see that, right? Under closed voting of all amendments on taxation for 40 years, inequality was the lowest in history. So just to get to the solution is to repeal what Nixon signed October 26, 1976.
Did you win?
Repeal what Nixon signed October 26, 1976, which opened the committees, which opened all this, just opened everything, right? So there was enough transparency back then. You could still see the floor vote. You have floor votes don't bother me. You still see position statements made by your Congress people. But all the things that we don't follow, why would we let the person who gets hit by the drone follow it? Right? Because they're the people who want to take out. If you want to take out the oil companies because they're a little tougher than the drone strike victim, the only way is secrecy. It's the only way your Congress people are going to have the power to do that. And the oil companies are there on every climate meeting. I've got 1, 2, 3, so I'll do you in order. Go ahead.
How does this idea about transparency apply to the elections we have every 4 years, where we have a referendum, essentially a national referendum, and we all go in, close the curtain, and when we vote, and I'm sure just judging from how Brookline generally votes, that people would agree we didn't get a great result this time around. But we all were in secret, so we weren't being intimidated, or we weren't being bought, we weren't any of those things. But what do we get?
Well, just because you're unhappy with the vote doesn't mean it's a problem with transparency. It seems.
Well, no, there was, I mean, it was secret.
Secret,
It was a
right,
secret ballot.
I didn't say secret produces only good causes. We know traditionally when you have secret ballots, you tend to get less vote buying, right? Tammany Hall was buying and intimidating all the votes in New York, switched the presidential election well, he wasn't a person, like Tammany was a group, but they switched the presidential election from New York because the votes were open. So open voting has got its history, and it's not good at all. I would suggest that what we looked at this year was very similar to what we looked at with Obama in 2000, when he first ran. 2008, right? Why? Obama's running on change. He's running on, if you saw one of my first graphs, right, the inequality's been going up nonstop ever since. We're literally the highest levels of inequality of all time. People are really unhappy. We're sitting here in Brookline, yeah, it's okay, not so bad. People are really hurting in this country. No uncertain terms about it. He's sitting on top of that wave, but that wave kept going up under him. So he says in 2009, 2010, he goes, the most important problem in the United States is inequality. In 2014, he goes, my biggest failure in office is I didn't do anything about inequality, which has risen under my term. 95% of the gains have gone to the top few percent. Elections get driven by anger. Hillary was not the change candidate. She was the keep it the same candidate. If inequality is bothering you, there's no question on who you're going to vote for. Anybody but keep it the same, because inequality is driving up. So a lot of people talking about inequality as being a major driver of both elections. People at Harvard talking about that frequently. So yes, we were comfortable. We wanted the incremental sort of stay the same, because I live in a nice house in Brookline. But you read Hillbilly Elegy and you know it's something else is going on in this country. Go ahead.
I read in the Globe that Massachusetts has the greatest income disparity of the 50 states.
Massachusetts does.
Yes. Aren't we one of the bluest?
Yeah. It's bad. It's bad.
For the Globe, you know, these surveys that say we got the best education, public education system in the country. We have the best medical, healthcare. We also have the highest rates of child abuse.
Child abuse. You have a lot of people not even on the unemployment list, because if you're not on for 6 months, you just consider working, right? So that even though unemployment drops after a while, you know, it's not an honest figure. I don't know. I mean, these are bigger than me. A lot of these ideas are way bigger than me. I'm not going to tell you I've got the solution for all of this, but I definitely have some interesting correlations with some of this, and it's certainly something to consider as we're going through this. Josh.
James, if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're proposing again is that the Congress revert back to you said 76, to basically close the committees. Leave the floor open, but close the committees. Completely and totally. Is that what you say as your ideal proposal?
Not my ideal. That would be good. It would work well.
So
I believe that all transparency is a problem. So all sponsorships are a problem. So if I sponsor a bill, my name gets put in the public record. So if I sponsor something against the NRA, well, my name's up there. Can that be prone to intimidation, or can it be prone to bribery? Well, certainly you can. I'm not even talking sponsorships were public before that. Co-sponsorships were public before that. I'm saying you have to give legislators some place where they can take it to the power. And those committees are in markups, right? The pictures you see now are this markup where they're changing the actual wording of the laws. There's no constituents in there, even though they all vote. Well, actually, not all of them. If you go to a Novartis thing where they're all from Switzerland, right? You know, they're not even Americans, right? With more power than you do. Go ahead. So where were you?
Well, as importantly, not just what gets written, but the things that actually die.
Correct.
Things that never come out of the
Absolutely.
room, that would never make it to the floor.
Absolutely.
But so again, I'm sort of going back to what your sort of incremental step in your, from what I'm hearing you say, a good first step would be to close the committee.
Right, I agree. I think.
And then essentially close the floor later as well, or what sort of, if James gets to wave the magic wand,
Yeah,
what
I
does
would
it
close
look like?
everything. We've seen evidence of corruption on everything. So there's the 2003 Medicaid. Does anyone know the Medicaid story at all? You've got Barney Frank, a local guy, at 2 in the morning on the floor as the vote is open. It's been open for 2 hours, yelling, and you can see this in the 60 Minutes on this, yelling, "Stop the arm twisting." What does that mean? Stop the intimidation. You have a female congressperson on the floor crying because the vote missed by 5 what George Bush needed. He thought he had it. You wouldn't take it to the floor if you didn't think you had it. But people turned on him at the last minute. And they left the vote open for 4 hours as they went and beat up. And we know that because there was actually court cases on DeLay and some of his associates about pressuring those votes. So that's the floor vote. I tend to think floor votes are safe because if you can do a lot of nasty stuff in committee to take out the NRA, you can take out oil, you can protect, you can package stuff, and then certainly if you're aware of these games, you can do it better. My guess is they just slipped there. They didn't really know what they were doing in committee, but they didn't have much chance because transparent ends. Go ahead.
I read some of your stuff before coming here.
You are Diane back there.
Yeah, Diane.
Yes. Diane.
And the nagging problem that I still have, based on reading your stuff and now hearing you, is this assumption that if you close the committees, and I understand what you're saying, how that could help, but it's assuming that people are really good or are gonna do the right thing. Why should we assume that?
I don't assume that, actually. It's actually a strange, so yes, if I was gonna close the committee and one person was a legislator in that committee, I mean, you gotta be crazy, right? I'm giving all the power to this one person, he can do whatever he wants. But you have to think about how numbers work. So, say for example, you wanted to corrupt Congress. Well, the first thing you might think to do is you're gonna go bribe a congressperson, right? That would seem to work. So, I want legislation passed, I go over and bribe you, right? I give you 50 grand, you vote for me, right? Where have I gotten if I've corrupted one person out of 435 votes? I've actually gotten nowhere. Okay, so when these committees are closed, these are people, assuming we've elected them from different areas with different interests. Madison never assumed they were wonderful people. He said, try and get wonderful people, which Brent reminded me of. But he assumed that they all were corrupt in some way. They all were special interests in some ways. So when I arrive in Congress, for example, I'd be like, pass better legislation for the New England Patriots and give me this new bridge and I want the new dig. Okay, but I arrive in legislation, that's all I really care about, even though I campaign on other stuff, or maybe I campaign on that. Now I've got to convince all of you to vote with me. Well, if I've got pressure over you, if I've got power over you, I can force you to vote with me. But if we're going to pass a bill together, now I've got to go, what do you need for your district? What do you need for your district? What do you need for yours? We need at least half of you guys to come together with all these corrupt ideas. And by the time you've done that, you've got general legislation again. You're no longer a special interest. You're forming legislation that improves the lives of a majority of the people. And so again, if you have a single individual, yes, they're very corruptible. The whole design of Congress is to have so many, sort of like Brownian motion, right? You won't have all the cells all of a sudden jump up and move across the room, right? They're all going in different directions. Try and get 3 people to agree on a movie at night. Well, you know, 11 people in a committee is pretty difficult. 435 voting secretly is even harder. What's interesting about that is the length and complexity of bills shoots up in 1970. Why? Before 1970, they had to read them, and they had to understand them. And if they didn't like what they read, they'd just go, hell, I don't even understand, throw it out. Afterwards, if you're pressuring, you're saying, you have to vote for it because I've got power over you, I can write anything I want. And that's where the tax code goes haywire. Because if you can write anything you want, believe me, the tax code governs the air we breathe, the ground we stand on, whether there's even a brook line. The tax code is everything. And the tax code is just shredded beginning in the 1970s. So there's one guy down in Florida who says the difference in legislation alone since the 70s is a $2 trillion shift of money from the 99% to the 1% per year. Per year. That's $6,000 per person of capital, just from legislation alone. he's not the only one saying it. Hacker and Pearson say that the shift in the tax code accounts for at least 1/3 of what we see in inequality. Just the shift in the tax code. And how many of you can understand the tax code? Right? We're citizens. We're going to follow Congress, right? No, the only people who understand the tax code are the people who get shot by the tax code, and they understand that one line of the tax code. They don't care about the rest. Go ahead.
One question and a point after.
Yeah.
The question is, was there a relationship or numbers that vary from opening the transparency of the 70s and the voting numbers, constituency and voting? Did it increase? I know in the US it is very low, the democracy. And the second point goes to the local government and the local elections in Brookline. But please.
Okay, well, it's really interesting that, you know, turnout in the 1870s in the United States in some counties, voter turnout was 110%. Why is that? Why is it 110%? Well, if you're paying people upwards of $20 in 1870 per vote, they might shave. They might shave, yeah. They might vote often. George Washington says he lost an election because he didn't buy enough booze. And I'm old enough still, I'm 52, to remember in the small town of Hope, Michigan, where I was growing up at the time, voting parades, which are a throwback to that era, where you buy all this booze and everyone would march together with the flags, you throw candy to the kids, right? And then you'd show up, and up until 1890, Massachusetts' first state to go in 1890, you would vote into a glass bowl with a colored ballot. And you better believe you voted, because that meant someone was going to give you money or not beat you up. So voter turnout's really good when you have transparency. Downs writes in 1950s, something like that, most people shouldn't vote. There's no economic incentive for them to vote. Similar to me here in Massachusetts. Am I going to go out and vote for Hillary? She's going to win. I mean, polling errors aren't big enough to suggest that Hillary's not going to win. I shouldn't have voted. I voted, but it was a waste of my time, right? A lot of voters are making that calculation. A lot of voters might not even care between the few candidates. We like to think that voter turnout is sine qua non of a great democracy. It's not. You get a lot of people who are just interested in certain elections and are going to vote accordingly. Right now, because the country's so partisan, it's like a war. I'm going to turn out all my voters. I'm going to suppress all theirs. Screw them. Screw this. Do all the other thing. Congress was voting secretly. Their turnout wasn't great either, even on big bills. But I suspect a lot of them were going, I know that bill's going to win. I'd rather be home with the constituents. I'd rather be calling someone, spending time with my wife, anything, right, than going and voting for a sure thing. So I suspect a lot of that goes on. I don't know, though, because we can't get data on secret votes, right? So we can only correlate it to some of the incentives that we see. Go ahead.
Scholarship, it has to factor in both sides of an argument. Whether you dismiss one side or not, you have to factor it in. Can you say anything good about transparency?
I will say there's only one paper that I see cited frequently. It's 2014 Brookings piece. Again, we were talking about the wonderfulness of Brookings. It's written by a guy named Norman Eisen, who he went to law school with Barack Obama, worked on his campaign, became the, I don't know, something for Czechoslovakia. So he wrote this really provocative piece because there's been enough people grumbling about transparency for a while. And his piece is called Why the Critics of Transparency Are Wrong. And this is the only piece that I see cited by the Sunlight Foundation, Transparency Orbit. All is when they want to support transparency being good. He cites the beginning of transparency and builds his entire paper off of the date 1986. Now, I know, just by doing my research, that transparency started in 1970. Where does he get the 1986 number? That's the day they introduced the televisions into the Senate. So if you look at his big graph on his thing. So he missed. So he tries to correlate. Well, I don't see voting increase. I don't see anything else increase. Transparency is clearly not a problem. Then therefore it must be good. He's built his whole thing on junk. Now, what would so that's the academic, right, that's the most academic piece that I know. So which is interesting in that, don't you think there might be something else out there? In my 3 years, I've come across it, right? What would be the advantages of transparency? Where would I enjoy the vote? I do think there's a legitimizing aspect, right? So people would like to feel like they can follow things. Pretty bad, aren't I? Pretty bad, like struggling here. Has anyone got, I mean, just, what's an advantage if you know, that you can see that might fit with this model?
Going on right now, you know, remember how when Obamacare was passed in 2010, Nancy Pelosi said, "You've got to pass the bill in order to know what's in it." Remember a famous you know, and
Bills
now-
have grown so big. Like I say, back in look at the Bill of Rights. Who wants to read in Congress? I don't got time to read. If you want me to pass what you want, you better write it so I can read it. But as soon as it doesn't matter how you're voting, I mean what you're reading, because you can pressure a vote. You know how many omnibus bills there were before 1970? One. And it was under 400 pages. The growth and rise of omnibus has everything to do with the fact that you can just stick anything you want in there because no one's going to read it. They're dropping these bills sometimes 2 days or 3 days before they vote. I've spent a year trying to read the 2014 budget bill. I haven't gotten through it, right? And there's nothing there that's fun to read. It's like one line after another. It's sort of like reading the 10 Commandments with numbers. It's slow. So we should probably wrap up. If anyone's got a real pressing question, please feel free to add. You want to, one last question, and then we'll wrap up. But if you have other hot questions, please come after me. Brent is my co-author back there. Showed up just after the beginning of the talk. So Brent and I have been working on this for a number of years. But he would also be happy to talk to anybody.
So to answer your question maybe about, or I think you can answer this, the potential benefit of transparency being that in a delegate-based system, instead of a trust-based system, transparency has it's a general control against the constituent, or for the constituent rather than against the constituent in a trust-based system. So if like you have the UN is voting and you have a bunch of delegates all together voting on a certain bill, and you have a committee that is transparent in the scope of the UN voting on, or not on a bill, on a resolution. While it does increase pressure on the member states, the constituents also can be a special interest within the scope of that arrangement. So, you know, the constituency can form groups or coalitions or can pressure their State Department to actually pass or fight for a certain resolution in that regard. So you can have the constituency be a special interest.
That's the theory of how it works now, right? Oh, Exxon's doing terrible things. Constituents will form. They'll form a group and they'll go take on Exxon. And we know how these battles end up, right? The constituents get to march in the street for one day and Exxon gets to go into every meeting and pressure the hell out of everybody and take people out. The delegate, this is kind of like getting into the heavy theory of representation, the delegate versus the trustee. The delegate is someone who always does what you tell them to do. Whereas the trustee works well with closed doors. They do what they think is right. So Kennedy hated the delegate model. He's like, you hired me, I'm gonna come in here and do exactly what I think is right, and I'm not listening to you anymore, right? The people aren't, you know, I study this stuff, it's too complex, let me deal with it. So he was a big fan of the trustee, which I am. The delegate model, I'd say, is a step down from referendum, because you're subjecting it to all the corruption. If all I want is you to vote the way I want, why don't I just vote the way I want? In the old days, you could understand, right? I can't get on my horse every day and go and vote, right? And phones don't work, and so I need to send a delegate. As soon as you can vote for everything, you should just vote for everything. Delegate offers no benefits, in my opinion, over referendum. And a lot of negatives, right? Because you can change the vote if you don't want to. So, but thank you so much. Thanks to,
One question. So, To bring it to the local level, to Brookline, are you advocating that we should encourage a lack of transparency and accountability and secrecy, or at the local level?
I don't know Brookline. Remember, I have one caveat versus this system, and so Brookline may fit that caveat, which is if you have a special interest in your legislature that's of a majority state, so say they all live on Tappan Street,
Walking out of a
right?
meeting like that.
Then you're gonna have problems with the legislature under secrecy or transparency. You're gonna be screwed in either, and then in that case, I probably prefer transparency. So you have to think about the individual conditions. I don't understand the way it works in Brookline, but I do know that if you make it transparent and you don't have a special interest, a large majority of special interest in there, transparency prevents the outside pressures. So you really have to look at the basic makeup of your legislature to answer that question. I'm assuming we're talking about a legislature, right? Are you talking about something else, like transparency of an executive type branch or a judicial branch? What are we talking about?
Executive branch?
Yeah, the executive branch, which corresponds more to FOIA, is not something that I do a ton of work on, okay? FOIA has got people complaining about it, but remember, FOIA is entirely different because the executive branch is entirely different. Why? Well, she asked the question about corrupting a committee. Well, it's hard to corrupt big numbers of people. The executive, remember, is one. It's really one person. Okay, and so the executive, when they veto a bill, it's voting no, and that's public. And when they sign a bill, that's voting yes, and that's public. All right, so the executive's always in a position of transparency, regardless of what you claim it is, right? Now, all the meetings they have underneath, of course, we don't know exactly what they're doing. I don't know. So, but remember, legislatures, executive branch, very different beasts, mostly because of how it works entirely. Legislatures, I would say, transparency is an absolute mistake. Separation of powers, I would say, maybe have transparency on the executive, closed on the, and it's traditionally the way we've done it in the US and tried. FOIA, I know, is 1966, but doesn't cover everything. FOIA doesn't deal with judicial or legislative, it's just executive. But there's a guy over at Columbia, Pozen, P-O-Z-E-N, looking at the troubles with FOIA specifically. I'm not that familiar with his work. So, but it is, please do not apply this broad scale to
What is
Freedom of Information.
Oh, thank you. What is
FOIA's Freedom of Information Act passed 1966. Applies to the executive branch.
It's rolling over.
Correct.
Then it's going to be roughly for you.
Okay, and probably very similar. Thank you so much for coming.